Good afternoon and most welcome to Heidegger 1136. Yet another sunny day here in Sweden. I can't hardly believe my luck. It's the 2nd of September and still we are enjoying summer's weather. Everyone is walking around in shorts and seeming relaxed and happy. The day has been very stressful, interwalled with moments of peace, and I think that's a very good way of starting with the first take on the book The Cosmic Hologram of Jude Currivan, PhD. It has a foreword by Erwin Laszlo, he's rather famous, and for once I will not go to the explanation, I go to the lovely things directly. So since this is a chaotic day, I will do it in a reversal, and when I relax here we will come in deeper and deeper into the most interesting stuff directly. A little bit like carving off all the bad stuff in a lovely dessert and just having the crust or something like that. Although I do like the berries as well. This is chapter 10, page 163 of the book, and there is a little ingress. Human beings in both space and time act holographically, and the title is Holographic Behaviors. For much of my life there was no place where the things I wanted to investigate were of interest to anyone. And can you imagine who said this? It is actually Benjamin Mandelbrot, maybe one of the most famous scientists during the last century. So you see, the subject, the ideas were so new they couldn't even attract interest. And what I'm going to read now, I had no idea either. And it's close, but not very close to the Feigenbaum number. It is, in its way, entirely different. And I'm quite certain, for once, you'll be astounded. I'll read from the book. While we consider that our choices are of our personal volition, there's growing and sometimes astounding evidence that when aggregated, our collective behaviors also embody the all-pervasive signature of a cosmic hologram. Fractal patterns, self-similarity, scale invariance, harmonic resonance, and power law expressions are continually being revealed as permeating our human prescribed structures and organizations. We'll now encounter some of the discoveries that confirm that, as is the case throughout the so-called natural world, the ubiquity of holographic information imbues human-instigated phenomena as apparently disparate as the growth of cities and the interconnectivity of the internet, as well as such contrasting occurrences as the incidence of conflicts and the everyday events of our social activities. So far, we've explored the nature of what we usually call physical reality as manifesting from a superphysical and all-pervasive foundation of information that essentially co-created, directed and infused with and by information, playing out holographically and dynamically, and evolving throughout the space-time past, present and future of our universe. We've already seen an example of such collective holographic patterns when we touched on how Benjamin Mandelbrot's research into the price movements of corporate stocks has shown them to embed a multifractal structure. So let's now turn to some more of the increasing number of examples that are demonstrating the holographic and holarchic realities about our group and collective behaviors, and revealing that there's really no difference between ourselves and the rest of the world in terms of manifest patterns of reality. Let's start with the internet. Nobody planned the global internet. Back in the 60s, its original structure followed ideas by engineer Paul Baran, who suggested, in contrast to the centralized approach then prevailing, a highly decentralized computer-based communications network. The distributed structure of such a network, where each computer node is connected to a number of others, incorporates a high level of redundancy, which results in a setup that is robust, flexible, and less vulnerable to attack or systemic breakdown. In '67, computer designer Wesley Clark took Baran's idea to come up with an innovative database system for sharing information, which became the World Wide Web structures for website. More than 20 years later, Sir Tim Berners-Lee added the third key attribute when he developed and freely offered the computer language of hypertext that enabled data to be uniquely tagged and hyperlinked throughout the system. From these serendipitous but rudimentary beginnings, the net has continued to self-organize and develop with innately holographic characteristics. Clustered in cities, scattered throughout rural regions, and spread unevenly across all time zones around the globe, early researchers presumed that the computer traffic of net usage at the individual or corporate behest of users wouldn't display any such patterning. However, in '98, computer scientists Walter Willinger and Vern Paxson were the forerunners of a number of researchers investigating the statistics of such traffic across the World Wide Web over a period of time. What theirs and subsequent studies have unexpectedly, almost shockingly, showed is that across a wide range of timescales, traffic is self-similar and possesses fractal properties. While anyone who sets up a web page on the net also has choices as to how many outgoing links they include, they can't control the number of links their page attracts. So once again, the anticipation was that there would be no patterning in the nature of such connections. In '99, pioneer network theorists Reka Albert, Hawong Jong, and Albert Laszlo Barbashi decided to test this assumption by counting the links of a net-based database comprising some 300,000 documents and around 1.5 million connections links. What they found, despite the numerous unmanaged choices involved, was that its connectivity followed the holographically scale-invariant features of a power law. This is just beyond belief. They also discover the highly self-organizing and adaptive properties of the system and determine that like ecosystems and many other complex phenomena, the net develops in a sustainable but critical state. The holographic nature of the internet backbone, its principal data routes, was also proved in 1999 study by three computer scientist brothers, Michalis Petrus and Christos Faloutsos. They show that such scale-free networking also applies to the physical structure that supports the net. The node points of routers and the communication links with individual computer access points. According to the research company eMarketer, the total number of net users was nearly 3.5 billion by the end of 2016. 3.5 billion. Just as for the evolution and the emergence of biological complexity, the expansion of the net has revealed emergent properties that can be modeled using precisely the same mathematical tools as those to study biological ecosystems. Significant examples of its emergent behaviors are those of open source software, where anyone can make changes, the growth and success of independently edited wiki projects, such as Wikipedia, was so surprising that its editors have sometimes referred to it as the zeroth law of Wikipedia. It's stated in the following: the problem with Wikipedia is that it only works in practice. In theory, we know it can never ever work. Actually, it also works in somewhat theory. It is just that an emergent theory to incorporate its conduct has to be made in the future. Another scale-invariant power law exhibited by human activity is the incidences of conflicts. After 7 years of research, in 1948, British mathematical physicist Lewis Richardson published an analysis of some 300 violent encounters that had occurred during the previous century, and that ranged from small-scale skirmishes to the two world wars. With this and further data on even greater numbers of conflicts, what he revealed may seem extraordinary. He demonstrated that such displays of aggression, with a myriad possible causes and plethora of choices, obey exactly the same type of power law in terms of the rigorously close and logarithmic relationship between their frequency and number of fatalities, as does the regularity and the scale of earthquakes. This also shows that major wars aren't anomalous. Tragically, they instead are extreme events on continuous spectrum of human-caused disaster. In recent years, researchers including Neil Johnson at the University of Miami have discovered that the same power law also applied to the occurrences of insurgent attacks against US forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. In widening their analysis to include the timing as well as the ferocity of attacks, in 2011, Johnson and his team presented a further paper outlining a method for predicting the evolutionary progress of conflicts. It shows a familiar relationship known as a progress curve, which tracks how productivity increases across a wide range of human activities through an iterative process of experience and adaptation, as the continuing accumulation of information enables practice to make perfectly. Sadly, such productivity can occur in wars too, as the two sides learn about their enemy and adapt accordingly. The team study found a progress curve that relates the logarithmic of the attack numbers, first, second, third, and so forth, and the attack interval. By knowing the initial interval between the first and second attacks, the premise is that the future results may be predictable. What perhaps is even more revealing is that the adaptability of both sides reflects what's called a Red Queen process. In Lewis's carols Through the Looking Glass, the futile chase between Alice and the Red Queen eventually takes them back to where they started. In evolutionary biology, the term is used to describe the competition between hosts and parasites, or predators and prey, where the adaptation by one results in a corresponding response by the other, that in due course leads to equilibrium. What Johnson's team has effectively uncovered is the realization that the characteristics of recent, predominantly insurgent type conflicts have and will likely continue to make combatants in unwinnable and interminable Red Queen standoffs unless some form of sustainable resolution is found and undertaken to break the eventual impasse. It's a small world. A third phenomena that is innately holographic and demonstrated throughout human society is that of small world networks. For 3 centuries, scientific research focused on taking stuff apart to identify its smallest and most basic ingredients. While such a reductionist approach has been hugely successful, it is inherently limited, as it neglects the underlying connectivity that the more recent and progressively holistic approach of the past few decades has increasingly revealed. An example is what's called small world networks, which describe numerous situations where only a few links connect node points and with each other, thus allowing influence to spread easily. The typical number of steps between nodes grows proportionally to the logarithm of the number of the nodes in the network, making such a network innately scale-free and holographic. Understanding the linkages of such small worlds took a notable step forward with the well-known and seminal experiment conducted in the late 60s by American psychologist Stanley Milgram. In the days before the internet, he decided to test anecdotal evidence of small world connectivity by writing a series of letters to arbitrarily chosen recipients in widely separated areas of the United States. In these letters, Milgram gave the name and profession of someone in Massachusetts. He asked the recipient to pass along the letters to anyone in their own social networks who might be able to help the letters eventually reach their correct Massachusetts destination. Those letters that did manage to reach the target show that, on average, the chain from himself to the final recipient comprised 6 steps. leading to the widespread concept of 6 degrees of separation. More recently, the same experiments were conducted on the internet, with email substituting for Milgram's snail mail, but nonetheless, the same level of connectivity was still found. In 1998, mathematicians Duncan Watts and Steve Strogatz, both then of Cornell University, were the first to show that numerous networks exhibit small world characteristics. By modeling lattices, they discovered that taking a regular grid and simply replacing a few of its ordered connections with ones of differing lengths, they created a hybrid that combined clustering with freedom of movement, and that optimized the connectivity of the entire grid. In other words, they created a small world. As Watts rightly noted, acknowledging the enormously broad spread of small world applications, cite, "I think I've been contacted by someone from just about every field outside of English literature. I had letters from mathematicians, physicists, biochemists, neurophysiologists, epidemiologists, economists, sociologists, from people in marketing information systems, civil engineering, and from a business enterprise that uses the concept of small world for networking purposes on the internet." Small worlds enabled and optimized information to flow highly efficiently throughout the network, even when it's limited to merely local knowledge. Far earlier than the small worlds of the internet and social networks such as Twitter and Facebook, the prevalence of such scale-free connectivity throughout human societies engendered the sayings of news spreading like wildfire, appropriate given that both neurons in the brain transfer data and forest fires do indeed spread a small world network. Emails and library books. You might think that researchers have more important stuff to focus on, but studies on web browsing, email activity, and the borrowing of library books are further examples of the inherently holographic nature of our collective human behavior. In 2005, Albert Laszlo Barbarashi and João Oliveira broke new ground in the investigation of human dynamics by looking at the timing of a number of activities in everyday life and work, including emails, snail mail. Once again, their findings defied expectations. Instead of indiscriminate conduct, they revealed, just as for earthquakes and conflicts, power law structures of intermittent high bursts of action interspersed with low frequency of behavior, goes up and down like a wave. The following year, Barabashi and other co-researchers spotted power law relationship in the visitation patterns of web browsing by analyzing the time intervals between consecutive visits by the same user to the site of major online news portals. Further exploration of human interactions was undertaken by a group of researchers and published in the Proceeding of National Academy of Sciences of the United States in 2009, reviewing the communications patterns in 2 social internet communities, they found them to again follow scale laws between the fluctuations in the number of messages sent by members and their level of activity, revealing long-term patterns that stretch from days to more than a year. Once again, their findings surprised the team and, of course, the whole world. In 2010, Chao Fan and Jinling Guo and Yilong Cha decided to study another common activity, the amount of library books loans over time, and again found a pattern of the frequency of the usage to be fractal. Converting their analysis into complex networks of actions, they also discovered them to be scale-free and to embody small world features. So this means that things that everyone thinks are unpredictable and not law-given are almost like the hand of God, I can compare it to. And I think nobody is aware of these research results, or even the idea that there can be a regular pattern in the world. I think a big research in the late 90s said that 95% of the population thought everything, both on a small scale and on a big scale, were absolute chance. This goes to show, completely new for me, I think I read one article in a popular magazine here in Sweden called Populärvetenskap, Popular Science. But hey, that was like 7 years ago. I'm perfectly sure if I am to mention this to anyone, I will actually meet a doctor in sociology later today. I'll ask her if she heard about anything like this, predictability of greater systems that shows they are almost godlike features. Small gods or big gods, I don't know. Yeah, Ken.
You mentioned earlier Milgram. I suppose it's the same Milgram.
It's oddly enough, and of course, he was a genius. The experiment he did here had nothing to do with his other experiments. But it's interesting.
But what was his point he sending these letters? To say everything's connected, or what?
Well, he found a really odd thing that was unpredicted. I think this I heard something. They calculated that it should take 30 people or something like that for the letter to find its way back. So I have to ask one, and that person asks someone else and asks someone else. But it turned out to be only 6 people. And remember, it is one person in a nation, I think, that has 400 million inhabitants. 400 million inhabitants.
So he didn't write out a name on the cover?
Name and everything.
What was the point? So it would not find it. So he posted letters with the right names.
Yeah.
And then he hoped that they would find the right person.
Yeah.
But what was the point?
It's an incredible point.
Uh-huh.
What is the chance that...
And it's about...
Wait. What is the chance if you ask 6 people that they will know Kalle Lundahl in the whole of United States?
Okay, there is...
They had to know the person.
So inside the letter he mentioned, do you know this certain person?
Yeah.
Okay, so
that's what I said also.
Okay, but I didn't... it was a little bit... Okay.
To see what patterns might emerge in terms of the physical movements of people, in 2010, I read that, anticipating they would see a low level of predictability of such movements given the wide variations in demographics, people's differing arrangements between being at home and being at work, and the distances traveled. They too were shocked to find a very high 93% level of predictability. As they noted in their results, given the diversity of people they tracked, where they lived, and the lifestyles they followed, Despite the significant differences in travel patterns, we find a remarkable lack of variability or unpredictability, which is largely independent of the distance users cover on a regular basis. In recent years, the exponentially expanding ability to mine and process vast amounts of data is enabling scientists to ever more quantitatively analyze human dynamics. Progressively, systems theory are both utilizing this ability and also reframing an increasingly broad range of social and economic systems as complex networks, focusing on their informational interactions following holographic power law and thus scale-free patterning. They're aiming to determine the parameters of such interactions and maximize their level of predictability. While such research is still in its early stages, one important instance for our intermeshed globe is to understand and minimize the spread of disease. In late 2009, an outbreak of the H1N1 influenza virus was generally predicted to peak the following January, and accordingly, fast-track development of vaccine was planned to be completed in November. Alessandro Vespignani and his colleagues then at the University of Indiana thought differently. Using complex network theory, they instead forecast that the outbreak would peak in October, and the vaccine would therefore be too late. As it turned out, while the virus wasn't as virulent as expected, the Indiana's team's prediction were absolutely correct. While thankfully the epidemic wasn't as severe as threatened, its relative mildness actually held off a comprehensive adoption of the new method of prediction. It took a much greater threat, the 2014 outbreak of Ebola, to do so. In July of that year, complex system scientists at the Santa Fe Institute were invited to join a multidisciplinary group to mathematically model the epidemic as it tore through West Africa. Collating the various factors that affect disease transmission to understand how their interactions cause a major emergency, and so help determining effective interventions, they produced new insights. Significantly, the link between poverty and Ebola. The countries worst affected, Sierra Leone, Liberia and Guinea, have very few doctors and minimal healthcare capacity, while neighboring countries only have modestly more health infrastructure. They nonetheless passed a critical threshold of capability to withstand the outbreak by isolating cases and tracing contact to those infected to then quarantine exposed individuals. While the response of the international community in providing additional healthcare support during the 2014 epidemic was initially too slow, it then significantly ramped up, notably as foreigners began to catch the disease, and was finally contained. Reducing poverty and improving health provision in poorer countries is clear and present strategic need in order to prevent and manage future outbreaks. Nonetheless, the acumen provided by understanding the complex networks of interaction in those affected and the critical tipping point for deploying effective resources and support also provides key input to decision makers. So much information is known about personal preferences, choices, and movement that researchers are becoming able to track the informational entropies, the dynamic informational content of the choices and actions of every individual within a complex network. This tracking and analysis of information relating to individual and collective choices and actions is indeed improving predictability, whether from the relatively trivial, but often annoying, at least to me, pop-ups on my computer that suggest future purchases from past choices to the hope for and benign ability to head off health and financial disaster, and the co-creation of increasingly integrated social support. Yet, there is other and more malign potential. We already having the difficult debate between the perceived need for high levels of governmental surveillance with the aim of preventing terrorist attacks and the maintenance of personal privacy. We're having, though, far less discussion about how corporations such as Google and Facebook, in their pursuit of profits, are transforming our notions on what's private. Indeed, the interception of unencrypted broadcast traffic from mobile phones, for example, is legal in many countries and can be easily used by companies to build up progressively detailed personal profiles for profit-motivated purposes. Data mining, however, and tracking the informational entropies of people have wider potentially adverse outcomes than a loss of personal privacy, which surveys have shown to be more of a generational concern, with younger people being apparently less bothered by such considerations. The increasing lack of privacy inevitably incurs reduced personal security as others know even more about our behaviors and movements. Additionally, personal, corporate, and governmental systemized securities are also increasingly vulnerable to cyber hacking. There are a plethora of motives for such intrusions, but they are rarely benevolent. Enormously and rapidly increasing levels of information about us are, though, not only leading to less privacy and greater insecurity, but also unavoidably to greater influence over us, whether by governments or corporations, which in turn can be extended to control. While we may bear different views of their motivations, be they governments, institutions, or corporations, we might want to individually and collectively consider where we might be heading, or indeed subtly or not so subtly being herded before we reach points of no return. So it is the Möbius set that is showing up in different circumstances where we until recently, I would say only 10 years ago, thought all those things like economy, stock market, social welfare, accidents, and even things like warfare, terrorist attacks, to be absolutely random, have been shown to follow a pattern and having an inclination, massively enforced and affected by the general opinion as well. Our opinion on what's happening in the world has a big connection to what is actually happening. We can no longer discern from what is observed and the observer. They play in the same pair dance, like a waltz over the world, and not, so to speak, following the roots of the idea of the coordinate system, where only big things can affect big things and small things can only have minuscule or no effect on big things. It is now proven that the Mandelbrot set goes way beyond mathematics. It enters in all areas of human, material, and biological systems. Earthquakes are not random, which was thought until 2014. We now know they are predictable to a certain extent. They follow an inclination, and there is a system behind them. And for me, this is the most interesting way of understanding that the world, as perceived by maybe the egoistic self or the reflective self, is not at all as random, happenstantial, or caused by causes we can't see. Just instead, they are highly predictable, and actually the stock market is much more predictable than the weather. You just need to know how and have the knowledge. And I always thought that the stock market was just chance. No, it's not. There is an incredible difference between a skilled stock marketer who might not even be educated. There is a very good example of a Michael Johnson who didn't even have a formal education, but he seemed to have something else. What it was, nobody knows. But he became a billionaire in just 2 years, and he was excellent in predicting the fluctuations that we still today and probably will never have algorithms or equations or even a knowledge-based way of seeing the whole thing. I also start to think about Julius Caesar in his famous book about the wars in Gallia, Bellum Gallia, where he writes that he was following the gods, and he was incredible because that seemed to be his method of understanding things you could not really know. The movement of the Celts, the Gauls, the Germanic tribes, all over Galicia, where they ended up, how their attacks were, when they will attack, at what force they will attack, would they use horses, all those things soon developed into accountability and a predictability that is equal to zero. For Julius Caesar, it was nothing of the kind. He knew what he was aiming to. It was no chance for him. And I think this higher sense of knowledge is very different from the regular way of seeing things developing, either by cause and effect, where small atoms causes other atoms to move a little bit, and then you have entropy and you have gravitation, and in the end you can't predict even the next day what will happen. This is showing that there is massive predictive power, and it's also regulated systems that we can investigate, and maybe by reaching into our intellect, our true intellect, not a stabilized, ready-made platform intellect, but a flexible process like, we could enter into that and thereby making our own decisions more successful. And we can also see harmonies. Elsewhere in the book, harmonical figures are mentioned, numbers, lines. Those can actually be followed to make your predictions and your life more successful, happy, and invigorating. And this is what I call numerical harmonics, and I borrow the name from her. As we've seen, the informational patterns derived from complex numbers are universal in terms of describing the underpinnings of physical reality. So-called natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., aren't complex, yet are equally universal, discovered rather than invented. Physicist Frank Benford and linguist George Zipf have laws named after them that, in rather unexpected ways, predict and describe the underlying harmonics of creation. Benford's law states that the relative frequencies of numbers 1 through 9 follow a simple harmonic rule regardless of what phenomenon, system or process they describe. At whatever scale, regardless of the unit of measurement, meter, kilometer, degrees, crowns, euros, dollars, instead of each of the numbers being represented equally as leading digits in large data sets, the number 1 is 6 times more likely to be so than number 9. From diverse examples such as streets addresses, the distribution of Twitter users by number of followers, to the numbers expressed in mathematical and physical constants, only 2 basic requirements are needed for its harmonic relationship to emerge. The first is that the sample of numbers that quantify the phenomena is large enough to enable proportions to be established. And the second is that within the phenomena, the range of numbers is unconstrained. The law is most accurately reflected when the data are spread across multiple orders of magnitude and can be found in numerous phenomena that obey the logarithmic relationship of power laws. Kalle, you can give me some coffee. Sorry to bother. I think I need a power boost, if there's anything left. Cheers, mate. I can actually come with a good example directly here, what they are trying to show. For only half an hour ago, I was discussing Picasso with a butcher. And for some mad reason, come here, Kalle, and show your t-shirt.
Okay, yes.
In the exact middle of his t-shirt, we find Picasso. These are the sort of connections we are finding more and more. We usually think that the t-shirt consisting of textile, different atoms, has nothing to do with the verbal conversation I just had. They have found that there are significant connections. So the idea of unconnectedness, unpredictability and randomness in the world are now significantly being put into question. And especially, I think it's pertinent it's in the middle, because I wouldn't have looked here. In 2010, mathematical geophysicist Malcolm Sambridge and his colleagues at Australian National University in Canberra reviewed the presence of the law in 15 different data sets across physics, astronomy, geophysics, chemistry, engineering, and mathematics. From examples that included the depths of earthquakes, the brightness of cosmic gamma rays reaching the world, greenhouse gas emissions by country, and cases of global infectious diseases, they attested to its widespread applicability. Again, though, it also pervades phenomena and data arising from our personal and collective choices, and shows up in places as diverse as population figures, corporate sales and costs, electric bills, stock prices, and even the range of numbers collated from the pages of newspapers. So omnipresent is Benford's law that Sambridge proposed it as a new way of detecting anomalous signals. In human behavior and transactions, its absence had been used to detect irregularities, including evidence of financial fraud. And in 2013, Thomas Hare at Florida Gulf Coast University decided to go further afield to use it to test for such anomalies in the search for exoplanets. So they're using the same method that we find out about infectious disease, marketing, to find planets nobody can see in the universe. The database of the number of those already confirmed and the list of possible candidates were compared. When measured in multiples of either the masses of Earth or Jupiter, Hare found that most of the candidates do indeed adhere to the law, indicating that some 90% will eventually be verified. In a final elegant revelation, we even find this harmonic law of numbers interwoven with phi for the digits that make up Fibonacci sequence, progressively to conform to Benford's law. Zipf's law, which also pertains to both natural and man-made phenomena, was initially found to denote how the occurrence of any word is inversely proportional to its rank in the frequency table. So astonishingly, the most frequent word in any language will occur twice as often as the second most frequent, 3 times as often as the third most frequent, and so on. However, the harmonic nature of its description in inverse proportionality has been discovered to extend to many other circumstances. So, for example, in the cities in a country are ranked according to size of population, they will be in such twofold scaling. Thus, if the largest city in the country has a population of 1 million, the second city will have 500,000, and the third 250,000. In 1999, economist Xavier Gabaix analyzed the populations of cities in the United States, showing the adherence to Zipf's law. In January 2015, astrophysicist Henry Lynn and Abraham Loeb of the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Cambridge, Massachusetts, using population density as the critical variable, people and stars respectively, even found the same scaling model to be accurate for the growth of cities and the formation of galaxies. And now we come to a theme that is also covered in Goethe Bach music. Could I just take this, because this is going to be interesting for you. Music. We have previously noted that we both see and hear the world logarithmically. So perhaps it's not too surprising that spectral analysis of a wide range of natural sounds, such as waterfalls and waves on a beach, and melodic music, both human-made and birdsong, also reflect a holographically fractal distribution of the so-called pink noise. Pink noise. Its embodiment of fractal features where the intensity of the sound diminishes with frequencies to yield approximately the same energy per octave enables pink noise to feel naturally harmonious and resonant with our innate sense of rhythm. As science progressively researches the ancient understanding of the coherence of the harmonic and holographic nature of the manifest world, such fractal attributes of sound and music are not only providing the soundtrack to our experiences, but their importance is being increasingly recognized in non-intrusive healing modalities that utilize such universal harmonics and resonances as well. In 2014, Wei-Lan Cheng and Peter Law at the University of Science and Technology in Wuhan, China, and Hong Kwan and Richard Cheng at the University in Toronto in Canada reported on the use of music and ultrasound in stimulation therapies for treatment of illnesses, recognizing that healthy human biology is inherently fractal and that disease disrupts such patterning. They showed how the difference in dynamics between healthy and diseased physiology can be observed in many biological signals such as neural activity and variations in heart rate and breathing patterns. By showing how optimal stimulation techniques are able to guide disease back to health, they emphasize the value of pink sound and music to literally and effectively retune the human body and mind. They report a trend of increasing evidence from numerous studies that show such auditory stimulation to have positive health benefits for a range of conditions, including depression, autism, and dementia. And here I have to refer a little bit to a book I read many years ago, and now I'm taking up again, hopefully, and that is Gödel Bach. In that book, Hofstadter is indirectly pointing to that there is a higher system of functioning, and that Gödel looked for a lower model with axioms and theorems that were calculable in a computer or a calculator. Hofstadter is somehow pointing to that there are higher harmonies, harmonies that governs the world but also affects how much we understand them will affect what happens. And he took Bach as an example. And since the book, I think, was written long before this research came about, must have been written in the 1990s, maybe 1980s, there were no research at that time, what I know about, that showed that music, sound, and such things were following logarithmic harmonics, that like that of the Fibonacci series, which is a series of numbers, that the tones, if they are regulated in that way, it makes a better chance of having harmonious music. And it sounds so out of the box, and if it were to be presented to Hofstadter in the 80s, he wouldn't have believed it himself. But now, today, pink noise is an established thing, and it just doesn't stop there. Pink noise covers how plants grow, how water evaporates, also how odd things like a stew cooks. following the notes of the Fibonacci or the golden rule will make everything work better, and there is no foundations for these things. And I would say that's the point of Hofstadter, because what Gödel wanted to find was a human foundation, or a very limited foundation. And this is the same as Einstein wanted to find, a subjective, limited-based, human, or just egoistic, self-concerned understanding, like in the case of Einstein himself. This shows that the laws are not explainable because they are much more regulated, much more decisive all over the fields, no matter if it's food processing, chemistry, how you write a successful piece of music. I also heard that the Shakespeare works are following the Fibonacci rule, so there is a consonant every third time, and that makes for the harmonic, but also for the creativity. It seems to be developing at the same time. So you see here what Jude Currivan is so elegantly depicting and painting is the understanding that the subject is constantly involved in creating everything, but also in the very predictability and harmonies of the world. Do you have a question?
No,
I can continue for a bit, and you can put the question later if
Yes,
if you want to wait. Sorry. Black swans. While the harmonics of power laws and complex systems often apply, as we've seen across many orders of magnitude, they also demonstrate what's been dubbed by Lebanese-American scholar Nassim Taleb as black swan behaviors, where an unexpected and rare event occurs that has major effects. Such disproportionately important happenings throughout history, science and finance, in hindsight are usually acknowledged as having been possible, being hard to predict though, and often beyond previous experience. They're often ignored or peripheralized until they actually occur, and are then retrospectively rationalized. Examples quoted by Taleb include major scientific discoveries and the attacks of September 11, 2001. Taleb took the metaphor of black swan events from the Roman poet Juvenal's depiction of something being as rare as a black swan, and which was used much later as a common expression in 16th century London, when it was presumed that black swans didn't exist, when in fact they actually did, albeit on the other side of the world. He uses the metaphor to reveal the weakness of such limited thinking as the sighting of even one black swan, and undoes the viewpoint that mistakes the absence of evidence for the evidence of absence. Wow, how elegantly put. And I need to repeat that. Don't mistake the absence of evidence for evidence of absence. Also citing World War I and the rise of the internet as examples, and among many others of black swans events, he summarized them as being rare, having extreme effects, and being retrospectively predictable. Recognizing the difficulty in forecasting them, however, he rather urges robustness. what he calls strategies of anti-fragility, and attempts to mitigate exposure to those with potential adverse effects such as financial system collapse and optimization of organization and resources to gain the full benefit of those likely to be beneficial, such as the rise of the Internet. The ongoing challenge, though, arising from their inherently non-linear nature, isn't only recognizing them before they occur, but the playing out of their evolving and often equally non-linear consequences in the days, months, and years that follows. Just as in the past, future black swans, both positive and negative, will occur. Indeed, it's the ones that would be catastrophic and for which we should seek ways to ameliorate their potential destructiveness that we're least prepared for. Taleb and others have recognized the psychological barriers that often hold us individually and collectively in sometimes willful ignorance and denial, and prevent effective preparation for such threats. Such denial usually masks deep fears, and if we are progressively interconnected global society are to come together to plan for and meet such threats and deal with their aftermaths, we also need psychologically to not only recognize but also overcome such anxieties and the fear-based behaviors that they engender. Only then can we attain clear-sightedness, flexibility, robustness, and effectiveness required to confront and deal with a rare but potentially cataclysmic inevitability. All physical reality. The challenge of answering philosopher and cognitive scientist David Chalmers' famously hard question about the nature of consciousness, how something immaterial can arise from something material, the brain, is that it comes from an incorrect premise. Its fallacy is that assuming duality between the apparent immateriality of mind and the seeming materialism of the physical world. As we've seen throughout this book, as leading-edge science is coming to realize, such apparent separation is illusory. Instead, the entities of the physical world is being discovered to be literally the all-pervasive expression of informational processes. And that includes us. Our personal thoughts, emotions, choices, action, and behavior patterns are distinctive. Yet as we've considered, as more and more analysis of human activities are investigated, it's becoming increasingly clear that while arising from a myriad of individual decisions, our group and collective conducts embodied exactly the same holographic signatures as are exhibited throughout the so-called natural world. How we work internally, our emotions, our wants, our intentions, our intellectualizations are also governed by the harmonic rules. And by having a self trying to, in a Cartesian manner, to regulate all of the inside, a complete mess is eroding. We don't get any thought control. We don't get the golden line. And we know the golden line is the measure for all good intellectual work. And it's also the harmony of the body. And I have to make a parallel to Richard E. Lynn. The harmony of the heart consciousness is that really works. It's following the Fibonacci code, and it's following the golden measure. And we know those things to be the only workable things that can have an effect. Otherwise, the words will echo hollow without substance. This recognition, though, raises another question. Who makes our perfect universe? And I'll put a question here from Kalle. He really wants to ask some. Do you still want to ask something?
Okay, so yes, earlier we spoke about cities. We have 1 million, like in Stockholm.
Yeah.
And Gothenburg, 500,000 here.
Yeah.
We have Malmö, perhaps it's at
Quarter of a
least
million.
300,000 at least.
Yeah,
Okay,
something.
roughly speaking. It depends how you define metropolis and so. But okay, the most simple point was that with the example with the black swans, I have to understand. I didn't completely get the point, but
The point is the following. In the 16th century, they took the idea of black swans a bit further. They didn't see any black swans, and they made something absolutely illegal. From not seeing black swans, they made that into a law, that they could predict that there are no black swans. The only thing they could say is there is no black swans. There are absence of black swans. But they cannot go so far to, it's called in logic, going from induction to rule or deduction. So that's a major mistake. But we do that very often. Every time I open a newspaper, I don't do that anymore. I will see at least 20 of those mistakes. They are very common, and they are incredibly dangerous because they destroy everything. And I think most people in the world don't see the work of God in actions, as you see here. And therefore they infer, we don't see the work of God, and then they infer that God is not a possibility. So I don't think people any longer actively disbelieve in God. They just do this illegal thing.
I get the point. No, black swans made me think about apes, and the famous example with Heidegger.
Oh yeah, with the hand. Yeah, good one.
So Heidegger said that there are no apes with hands.
No, no.
And then Derrida said that no, Heidegger, did he go to the Black Forest and examine all the and Derrida got his laugh, and I wanted to defend Heidegger. That I want to say that Heidegger, no, Derrida was mixing nominalism with universalism.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
But okay, it's a good.
Yeah, and just for the note, I don't like using that terminology because that infers classical logic. But it has a name, and it's going from induction to deduction. But that's way too formal, and I cringe when I hear it. So forget that, but at least I know it, as you know. Well, we had to end there, and I say thank you very much for listening. It was a pleasure. Have a good afternoon, and bye-bye.
Thank you.